Welcome to the feast. For this conversation, I sat down with four of my friends, my sister and her fiance. The common denominator between us was we all have STEM degrees and careers, so we were all kind of excited to talk about our Catholicism and how we integrate science into that. So this is kind of an experiment in lots of people on a podcast. I kind of saw it as my role to keep track of the largest points, to kind of let them go on tangents, and kind of react to ideas organically. I think the goal here was to just kind of hit a lot of points so that listeners can kind of see how we think through these topics from a bunch of different angles. And I think that was largely accomplished. I think it actually turned out really well. I was pleasantly surprised with how smoothly it went because of the large number of people. We talked about how do we as religious people who are scientifically minded, how do we view science? Where do we place it in our larger worldview? How do we view tension or potential tension between science and faith? We shared some thoughts on the non-scientific claims of our faith, and that kind of segued into why do we believe in the faith stuff in the first place, which segued into kind of testimonies and our experiences, and why might we trust those experiences. There was some low volume, I think, because it was a living room setup, so turn up the volume. There was a sort of social glitch at the beginning where my friend Mike didn't know JoJo, and he thought he wasn't Catholic for a second, so that was amusing. Overall, I'm really happy with how this went, so hope you enjoyed as much as I did.
They're all like gotta go as Franciscans, you know?
And they're like, oh, I know this person. I'm
Follow
looking for
the
a job in the
Francis.
Catholic Church, and
Yeah.
they're hired over there, so I'm gonna go over there. And
Yeah, that's how it goes.
Builds up.
That's
Yeah.
how it
We're
goes.
recording now. That's why I started choking on my drink.
We are recording now.
As soon as we started recording.
Figured I'd get the ambiance. So there's not really a particular occasion for this little squadcast we got going.
Squadcast.
Yeah. All the
That's
cringe.
the new hip term for it. I think.
We're starting a trend. It'll be cool when it's trendy.
Squadcast.
How many views does the first podcast?
28.
Dude, I think we're up to like 30, bro.
Ooh.
Wow.
It's like
Wow.
the
We are breaking out right
And
now.
your family hasn't even
The
listened
hype is
to it
real.
yet. It's another 10 right there.
So I figured we got 5 engineers, 1 living room. Figured what else are we going to talk about? I was thinking faith and science. I shared my first podcast to a couple of you guys, and then you're like, wow, we haven't seen Steve in a while. Let's go down and hang out.
Basically.
And then it kind of turned into a whole podcast. And I think to kind of set the stage for people, might as well just kind of go around the room, maybe like name and what your degree was, and maybe like any kind of specialty within your discipline real quick. So like I'm Steven.
Sure.
I got a physics degree. Now I'm a mechanical engineer. Just to kind of set the stage for people.
Yeah. Mike, I have a degree in biomedical engineering. I'm in the Navy, but I'd say my specialty is more nuclear engineering.
David, my degree is in electrical and computer engineering, and now I do power systems as a national grid field engineer.
My name's Jameson. I also study electrical engineering, and I also do power engineering, but I do have a background. I run confirmation retreats for the Diocese of Worcester, Massachusetts.
My name's John. I have a degree in civil and structural engineering, and I now focus on construction management, especially large occupied renovations in commercial and residential market sectors.
I'm Emily. I studied biology. I now work as a personal trainer in a physical therapy office. So I'd say my emphasis was largely in exercise science, though most of my research was in stem cells.
I'm John Joseph. I studied psychology and had my master's in mental health counseling. I've a research background in attachment theory, psychological assessments, and hypnosis.
Ooh, that's interesting.
That's really cool.
Like that.
Yeah, so the two kind of common denominators we got is one, we've all got STEM degrees and careers, and the other is we're all Catholic. So I figured it'd be cool to talk about kind of how do we think about science as religious people. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and set the stage.
Wait, hold on. We got to address this. So I don't think all of us in this room are actually Catholic. So let's just so you were kind of signaling that. Sorry, it's totally cool if you're not Catholic.
No. He's
I'm not STEM.
psychologist.
I'm not STEM.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
STEM.
Not
Sorry.
It's science.
No.
Clearly, we all don't
Psychology.
know each other.
Psychology
Like,
science.
You went to
100%.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Sort
All
of.
right. Misinterpreting that. Yeah.
No.
We are all Catholic. And I would say psychology is still...
That's definitely
It's
STEM.
science.
Yeah.
It's a
yeah.
science.
This is science.
It's like the softest of sciences,
That's what they call it.
but
Definitely.
it's still
Call it,
science.
so.
You're not out of the group.
You're one of us.
You're one of us.
If you can replicate your studies, right?
Yeah. Hopefully.
All right, so I guess what I was hoping to talk about is how do we think about kind of science as religious people. I kind of got some questions and themes in the back of my head that we'll try to weave into the discussion, see where it takes us. What I think I'm going to do is ramble for a minute to kind of set the tone, and then if you guys want to jump in, I don't think this is not going to be a formal thing. There was a phrase I heard a lot in college and after graduating, which is I believe in science over religion. And the way I kind of process that as kind of a religious person, it's like someone saying, I believe in diet over health. It seemed to me like diet is just a subset of health. And so is that kind of the way we picture things? Is science a subset of what we believe in? Does it capture a certain subset of the human experience, but not the whole thing? Or do we kind of put it in parallel in a different place? You know, there's a phrase, non-overlapping magisteria. So when someone says, I believe in science over religion, does that register more as, I believe in good relationships over good health? Right? Is it just kind of a separate category that we believe in parallel? Do we think of it as a subset of what we believe in, or is it just a totally different thing? We have science on our left hand, kind of faith on our right hand, and together we kind of use it to process the world. Or is science more of a subset, or how do we think about it? Like, what's our gut reaction to that?
So, Steven, I know that you and I have many conversations about this, but I think religion and science go hand in hand, but they're not necessarily reliant on each other. I know that you and I have had many discussions where most of the largest scientific breakthroughs have been done by people in the Catholic Church or people of Catholic faith, such as, the Big Bang Theory, I believe, was proposed by a priest.
George Lemaitre.
Right, yeah.
And I think that the people of modern day America mostly see as science and religion as contradictory, not necessarily as working together, but the thing that I always go to is, the number one theory is, matter cannot be created or destroyed, so how did it get here? And that automatically ties back to our faith where, they say, well, it was just there the whole time, which breaks their laws of physics, but according to our faith, that has that explanation for the foundation of all of physics. So that's just immediately where my brain goes to.
I think with science, the question of science versus religion, science and religion aim to answer two totally different questions. With science, and I'm speaking more strictly on physical sciences, but that, to me, my understanding is that it intends to answer the questions of how things work, whereas religion is more of a question of how I should live my life. So they're completely different fields that attempt to answer completely different questions about reality and about life. So they're not contradictory, they're just completely different fields.
And at the same time, I think that they're complementary. Cardinal Schönborn, who's a German cardinal, wrote a book called Chance or Purpose. It was talking largely about evolution, but I think he describes the religion-science relationship very well in that they occupy separate realms, but they're both aimed at discovering truth, right? Whether that be immaterial or material truth, right? That's what they're kind of looking at, separate realms. And I think the only way in which they might contradict each other is if one oversteps their boundaries, right? So we take material conclusions from science, conclusions, right? Like, doesn't necessarily prove anything. but kind of theories and facts that we gather from the material world, and then we use them to try to describe immaterial realities. And the same could be true on the other side, someone from like a faith perspective, and they're like reading scripture and they're like, the universe was created 700 years ago, or whatever the creationist theory is, which, side note, might hold some truth to it based off of the theory of like relativity and time, whatever. You guys could probably talk about that more than I could. But anyway, I think that they're complementary in that they're both trying to get at truth, and that one actually could make sense in light of the other, but that they do occupy separate realms.
Yeah. So I'm kind of hearing a couple different flavors here. On the one hand, I think, Jameson, what you started off with was they are talking about science almost runs into a dead end because science is sort of an internal framework of understanding things, and it's like a closed loop, but we need to understand how the loop got there in the first place.
Exactly.
And it's like, what's the foundation on which this sort of closed system makes sense?
I think a lot of it depends on what the average person means when they say, I believe in science over religion. Because to me, that it makes me think of science being that which is immediately observable. And if not immediately observable, then like a peer-reviewed study that you can go look up. They're looking for evidence for this sort of God factor that people who are religious propose in the ignorance of anything metaphysical. They believe that which has evidence that can be seen, but so many things we believe in life, we don't necessarily require evidence for it 100% of the time. And notwithstanding, there are things that you could consider to be evidence in terms of religious truths that a lot of people propose, given Eucharistic miracles or incorrupt bodies, or Fatima, for example, the miracle of the sun, which had 70,000 witnesses. But even with that, it doesn't necessarily cut it for some people. But I think essentially it boils down to a person who relies on scientific evidence. They rely on something that's immediately observable. It's as if God needs to make himself known to them personally, individually, beyond all reasonable doubt, which, I mean, I don't know how you interpret that, but it might also kind of defeat the purpose of faith if God is made immediately evident beyond all reasonable doubt, because then you would have to, acknowledge him.
Well, I think like a good example is it's not really a practical way to live your life to only believe things that you can quantify or you can falsify or prove beyond a reasonable doubt with a scientific method. For instance, just with relationships with people or romantic relationships, I think are a good example, where you enter into a romantic relationship and you essentially have a certain amount of faith that person does love you and that they're loyal to you and faithful to you. And if you only believe things that can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, then you could never live really a fulfilling life, in the sense that you could never experience romantic relationships, because romantic relationships rely on some level, you could say, of faith or trusting in another person to mean what they say. And I think from a religious aspect, our relationship with God is kind of similar, in the sense that we don't really have proof beyond a reasonable, like, you can't really say that we necessarily have proof beyond a reasonable doubt in the same way that we prove scientific truths beyond a reasonable doubt for our belief in God, but we have this sort of trust or faith that God exists in the same way that we might have trust or faith that a person that we're close with actually loves and cares for us.
So there's a couple of great points that are being made here by Mike and John. There's a weird tension going on where religion makes claims that we can't test with science about, let's say, the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, right? That's a Catholic claim that has no scientific basis. And maybe you could point to a couple miracles, and kind of go down that rabbit hole. But largely, what you believe about heaven and the Eucharist and souls, that's not a scientifically verifiable claim. However, there's also points that maybe science and religion both can talk to at the same time. And I definitely want to talk a lot about that. I want to kind of close the loop first on kind of the original point, which was how, as a religious person who is scientifically literate, how do we see science in the grander scheme of things? And then I think if we close the loop on that, then we could kind of go down this other rabbit hole.
Oh, I love science. I think the development of the sciences has been one of God's greatest gifts to humanity. In the last 100 years, the leaps and bounds that we've made in reducing poverty, reducing child death rates, reducing diseases, eliminating all these forms of suffering that have been present throughout all human history. Science is something that has enabled us to systematically discover all these rich and exciting things about the universe that we occupy. I think that as human beings, we don't live, though, as scientifically minded people. I think, as Mike was saying, right, in a romantic relationship, there's a certain amount of faith, right? And I think that, not to get off topic, but the question of God is treated differently, right, in that, it's only in this matter that we have to have complete and utter surety. Like, there has to be some physical evidence, some evidence that we can quantify and verify. We don't do that with basically any other belief that we have, right? I believe that England is a island. I've never been to England. I have been in England. I haven't been to all the parts of England. I haven't walked all the way around it. I haven't, measured out all its different things, but I have this faith that it is, in a sense, But anyway, science is a wonderful, wonderful thing, and a lot of the great discoveries of science have been made by people of faith. I think most recently, the project by the National Health Institute for Health, the man who coded the human DNA sequence was Christian, and he has a wonderful talk on YouTube actually about faith and science that I think is valuable to listen to. I can't remember his name.
One of the things I think of with what you're saying about all the great things science has done, at the same time it's also enabled us to create weapons of mass destruction and biological warfare and eugenics and things like that. So science is a subset of religion. Like, what happens when science goes unchecked? Even though it's a sort of our human mastery of the material world, we can use it for good and we can use it for great evil too. And I think that's science. That's pure science's limitation. Is like, what's the boundary at which once you cross, you're into a realm that's doing harm to fellow human beings, which I think, secular or religious, mass harm to human beings is something I think a lot of people can agree upon is not something that we desire. So we need a check on the science. Right. So it's not something you can discover just by, scientific observation alone, like the limits to which you should pursue certain scientific endeavors. Like, there needs to be a sort of check outside the realm of scientific knowledge that controls it towards human flourishing. But I'd be interested in what other people have to say.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the people that are kind of the mind of being the scientific way of knowing is the only way of knowing the world, they fail to take into account the fact that there is actually benefit in having a moral framework or a religious framework of viewing the world, because then you can take all this information and all this technology, we can discover it, we can learn about atomic energy, we can learn about all these different ways to harness power or to use weapons against people. But if we don't have any sort of moral or religious framework of how we should act when given this technology, then we as a species are actually not benefited by just purely scientific knowledge or purely scientific understanding. So I completely agree that having some sort of knowledge outside of just the purely scientific is actually beneficial and useful and true, you could say, to an extent.
Yes, and to bring that full circle, I think the biggest distinction between those of faith and those without faith is really the existence of the soul, and going back to metaphysics. And as religious people, we tend to explain things in terms of the souls and what it's going to do to your soul long term, for example, sins and those kinds of things. And that's really the largest divide between the people of pure science and the people of religion, is that the biggest separation is, as people of religion, we believe in the existence of the soul, and that's the hardest part to explain to them, because that's not, again, going back to the very beginning, that's not something you can physically observe. That's something that you have to believe exists through the actions of human beings and individuality and those kinds of things. So just to kind of wrap that.
Yeah, so kind of what I'm getting out of this kind of first phase of our discussion here is that okay. So what I'm getting out of this is, when I ask the question, what is science to religious, people like us Catholics, I'm kind of getting three flavors of answers. I think there's a philosophical answer, there's an existential answer, and there's a moral answer.
I can add one more. As a religious person, I think science is, so for us, the arts are, expression of music or, paintings or those kinds of things. As me observing science, the sciences, quote unquote, I feel like that's us observing the creation of God, because those are the things that he creates in the purest form, though we may manipulate it into things that he does not desire. Just the existence of the world, the universe, and all things as a whole is kind of God's greatest art project. So as a religious person, I view science as the largest form of ultimate art. That's just a personal thing.
Yeah. So
like that.
all right. So yeah, four things. I would say there's a philosophical way of viewing it, which is science kind of runs out of steam, and we have to look farther for deeper philosophical explanations of why things are, and that's an opinion that we kind of share. There is a existential one, which is, I'm drawing a blank on what it was.
It seemed to me
It
that
was.
the philosophical and existential are
Intertwined.
quite similar. The existential being that science doesn't provide us with a sense of meaning. It doesn't provide us with any answers to the question
we are
why.
here.
Oh, I think actually what triggered that in my head was something Emily was saying, was we use faith and we use science to understand ourselves and our place in things, and we use those toolkits separately but complementary, and that's how we understand ourselves, and that was the existential point. I think that's what triggered my mind. So if the philosophical one is when science runs out of steam and we need more explanatory power from metaphysics for the universe, and the existential point is using the toolkit of science, the language of science, and the language of faith together and complementary to understand ourselves. That would be the existential point. I think the moral point, which is what you guys were talking a lot about, was you can make an atom bomb or you could make a medicine, right? It's how do we use science? And then there was a sort of artistic outlet, which is there's something fundamentally, there's a creative idea at the heart of faith, of how God creating the universe.
There's something beautiful
Yeah,
about
there's
it.
like beauty
There's
links
this-
science and
And I think everybody's experience at one point is that there's something, an emotion or an experience that we all have had, at least at some point in our lives, I would hope, that, that there's a beauty and a fascination that we have with the world around us. And I think you see it in kids. Kids are just like, they'll walk over to a bug and they'll go right into the
Sense of
bug's
wonder
face,
is
right?
just-
And then it's just something that captures our attention about nature and the universe.
Even in a more detailed spectrum, you see, a minor mathematician shows the golden ratio and the Fibonacci sequence appears basically everywhere. Like the spiral that of the seeds and that a sunflower grows is this Fibonacci sequence. There's so many different things where the Fibonacci sequence appears.
We were just talking
literally
about
just
this.
talking about this like with someone before we came here.
Wow.
The
Yeah,
golden ratio.
it's amazing.
Yeah.
Even from the scientific perspective,
No,
the
especially.
coincidences are
Yeah.
Well,
fantastic.
I know, like people talk about science and religion, and they seem to be these two. Either they're at odds or they're these two separate bubbles that never touch. But I think there are areas where science and religion do kind of touch on each other. And one area is the idea that if there is a God who's intelligent and who created the world, then he created the world in such a way that it could be understood, and that there's an intelligible order to it. So in a way, that's kind of what science is we're trying to unravel the mind of God and what he was, his design and of how he created the universe and how things work. So we have to assume that there is an intelligibility to the universe, and that goes hand in hand with the belief in an omnipresent, omnipotent God, as described in our faith. So.
And that's religion, right? Religion is our relationship to that God.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's kind of segueing here. You could look up the scholastics, and you could just, if you look up scholasticism in Encyclopedia Britannica or like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or Wikipedia, they all say the same thing, which is we had scholastic philosophers, which were basically theologians who also studied kind of subdisciplines of science and arts and all that, and that one subset of natural philosophy, that was exactly what you were saying, was we believe that the universe is intelligible, and we can learn about God kind of backwards by looking at what's intelligible and figuring out what's the intelligence behind it.
Yeah, but there's so many assumptions behind that, right? Epistemologically speaking, anyway, that first of all, nature around you is understandable and intelligible, and that second of all, that we are actually interacting with that and capable of understanding, that we have the hardware to actually pick it apart. Like that in itself is an act of faith, I would say.
Yeah.
An assumption that you can't do science without.
That even ties back to quantum physics, where what is it? You can't when you observe a particle, you can only see what it is at that exact moment, but you can't know where it is at all times. Is that that's quantum physics, right?
Yeah.
Approximately.
Well, that's the Heisenberg uncertainty,
Exactly.
which is you can't know what location and momentum to within a certain certainty at any given time.
Yeah, that's it.
All right. Awkward silence. Let's go.
Well, I mean, to just go off that, I mean, we can condense so many scientific principles down to laws like thermodynamics, quantum mechanics aside, or Kepler's laws of theory of orbital mechanics and things like that. I mean, there's no why kind of to explain why these forces and materials behave the way they do. I mean, maybe at some point you could delve deep enough scientifically to find an answer, but as far as we've gotten into scientific development and our knowledge of the universe, I mean, there's still nothing conclusive to deny the validity of a religious explanation towards what we can observe. They really do go hand in hand, from what I can tell.
Okay, I think that's a good segue. So, I think we've kind of closed the loop. I think the initial question is how do we, as religious people who are scientifically literate, how do we see science? I think we kind of bashed that one to death. I think the next follow-up question that people would have is aren't there points of tension between science and religion? If religion if we have a faith narrative and we have this narrative of how the cosmos works, and it's a faith-based narrative, and then we have kind of on the side here science working. It's its own internal mechanism. It's doing its own thing. Science here off to the side, and it's coming up with its own narrative. Are there any points of contention, because they're kind of going off their separate ways here? The faith narrative versus the science narrative. Have we kind of experienced any points of tension between these two narratives of a scientific way of thinking about things versus a faith way of thinking about things? And I guess the analogy I would give is, let's say you wanna get better vision, and one way to do that is to put glasses on. Because it just gives you a better view of the natural world around you. That's what glasses do, right? And I think that's a metaphor for science. It just gives you a higher resolution picture of the natural world. One way to do that is to put glasses on. Maybe your vision is so distorted that you need a cornea transplant, but that's kind of an artificial solution, where you're grafting a scientific framework onto a religious narrative, and then you have to be on, anti-rejection meds for the rest of your life. Do we view the scientific narrative and the religious narrative, are there points of tension for us? Is it like putting on glasses where it's a natural fit to the head that just kind of helps us see things more clearly? Or is there a tension there?
So, talking on this particular topic, I mean, over the history of the Catholic Church and over the history of just faith in general, there has been points of contention between science and religion.
Yeah.
But the big point of it is that though they have different narratives, both of them lead to a greater understanding of our faith. When we get to those points of contention and we get to those situations where it seems like science may contradict religion at that time, that causes us to look back at our spirituality and grow a bigger understanding of what it actually means on our faith side. So like, I don't really see it as something that's inherently like destroying religion. Instead, it's improving it in the sense that basically as we become more knowledgeable scientifically, it also gives us that. It's basically like adding the glasses, getting the lens, getting a clearer vision, and then starting to revise like, okay, what does this mean from a religious perspective? And then growing those two in basically different narratives, but they grow together. The conflict occurs when some major breakthrough occurs in like religion or some major breakthrough occurs in science. And then that's when we have to look back and see from the other perspective to be able to grow both of them in the direction we want them to go.
Well,
So is it a tense harmony or a harmonious harmony?
I would say it's tense.
I would say, but only bad science.
Right.
You know, so like, and I think the prime example of this being Galileo, right? So, so I've heard Galileo come up several times, but people don't actually
So
know.
about like the heliocentric
Yeah.
versus geocentric.
People don't actually know the history
Yeah.
behind it. If you read the letters that Galileo sent back and forth and that the Pope wrote about, at the time, I can't remember the Pope's name, about Galileo and the exchange between them, it wasn't that the Catholic Church was trying to shut him down or prevent him from publishing his findings. It's that he was actually presenting his findings even before he had the evidence to support it. I remember there's a book that he wrote to try and slip past, because the church at the time was very intertwined with the state, right? And so during that time there was a lot of political leverage going on, right? But Galileo was just, in a sense, the popes basically said, hold up on publishing these, like you don't have and there was other scientists who had read his work and who agreed that he didn't have quite enough evidence to present his findings as fact, but he went past that and attempted to, and then so what he did was he actually wrote a book between Simplicitus and this other person, I can't remember what he named him, but that basically the heliocentric guy was presented as smarter and more, and that the Simplicitus was basically the earth-centered view.
Jeez.
And that so it was this work that he had published, and people will say, oh, Galileo was persecuted by the church, and that's kind of what they hold up as the golden standard between this tension between science and religion. But in my mind, the only time that there's tension is when there's bad science.
Bad science, or like I was saying earlier, you take conclusions from one and try to extrapolate that and form conclusions about the other realm.
Would Darwinian evolution be bad science? Has that not produced tension?
I think
The Catholic Church specifically believes in, I believe they believe in evolution/creationism, where God created us and then evolved us. The Catholic Church, I believe that's what
Or a
Catholic
sense
so
that
actually-
it could be, but
So
Quick pause, maybe.
Yeah.
Quick pause. So there's a difference when I say, are there tension points between faith and religion? Are we talking about tension points between scientists and religious people, or the science itself and the faith itself?
When you say that, I think of specific things that the Catholic Church teaches that you could falsify with science. So an example, if the Catholic Church teaches that God created a man and a woman and there was nothing before that, this is where the evolution versus creation debate comes into play, where let's just say the church teaches that the earth is 6,000 years old and that Adam and Eve were created from nothing and that's how everything got started. Well, there's, I think, compelling evidence contrary to that. Now, the church doesn't actually teach that, but what the church does teach is that there was an Adam and an Eve. You don't necessarily have to believe that they were instantaneously created or if that they maybe they had ancestors that evolved from lower species. But I think you could maybe argue at some point in the church's history that I think if you had asked people 1,000 years ago, oh, were Adam and Eve, did they have ancestors? Everyone would have said no. That would have been the accepted church teaching. So what happens is, the way the church works, in my view, is we have these theological truths, or religious truths, which one is that there's Adam and Eve. We learn more about science, we learn more about the universe, and then in a way we sort of, I don't know if adapt is the right word, but we sort of integrate
And
the
develop.
scientific, we integrate and develop the scientific worldview with our religious worldview.
I think the church kind of just, I don't think they declare those things as doctrine or dogma just because, I mean, there's certain moral truths that they declare, but they leave other things up to interpretation. I mean, when you come from an evolutionary perspective of Adam and Eve coming, like at what point does the human soul come into creation? Like, does, a monkey have a kid and suddenly it's a human being with a soul? It's a tough problem to tackle, and you can get down a pretty deep rabbit hole with that. But it kind of takes us away from our question centrally, although it's a good example of contention, for example.
Well, I think that would be the tension point, which was maybe a gut reaction to that is, no, it's absurd. A monkey's not going to pop out a kid and it's going to be totally different.
Can I point out another...
That would be a point of tension, you know what I'm saying?
I would like to point out another contention point, which is before the theory of the Big Bang, it was actually common for scientists to hold an idea about the universe being continuous, or I don't know what the exact name is, but essentially they didn't think that there was necessarily a beginning to the universe. In other words, an eternal universe, and
static.
So you could go as far back, you could go infinitely back in time. And when the priest, we don't remember his name, but whenever he came up with this theory for the Big Bang,
George Lemaitre.
There we go, George Lemaitre. So whenever he came up with this theory for the Big Bang, it was actually criticized as being overly supportive of a theological worldview because it pointed to a specific start to the universe.
He was with there's pictures of him working alongside Einstein.
Yes. And actually that's what really gets my goat when you have fundamentalist Christians who attack the Big Bang as being some atheistic idea, when in actuality it was devised by a Catholic priest. It actually challenged the atheistic worldview at the time. And realistically speaking, I don't think it actually is a challenge when you integrate our theological understanding with the scientific worldview understanding. I don't think it is a true challenge to our faith in that the universe was created by God.
Well, we kind of know the universe is, as it is now, it's not infinite because of entropy, right? We're eventually going to reach heat death in however many billion years from now.
Trillions and billions of years, yeah. I mean,
going back to the first question where it was, how do we as religious people view science? I think we as religious people view science as supportive to our religion. I think the biggest conflict is the other way around, where how do entirely scientific people and atheistic or agnostic people view religion. I think that's really where the contention happens, whereas they see religion as essentially false answers to questions that they think that can be proved by science, where we see it as science as supporting evidence to our faith. They see the faith as excuses for not learning more about the sciences, and I think that's really where the contention happens, not necessarily from us as religious people viewing science, but more as, like I said, atheistic or agnostic people viewing religion. I think that's where the contention veers.
John Henry Newman has a really great book. He's about to be a saint, and about the development of doctrine and how, because he lived in the 19th century where there was all these fantastic scientific discoveries that were going about, and he was trying to work within that context of how does doctrine develop, because we haven't had the same sort of understanding of even the Eucharist, right? I think Thomas Aquinas brought us a little bit further in our understanding of the Eucharist with transubstantiation and his use of Aristotle and Plato's philosophy to understand form and matter and how bread can become the body and blood of Jesus. And that might be something if you guys are interested in looking at when it comes to how the development of doctrine happens and how the church kind of understands science when it challenges or appears to challenge some of our central doctrines.
So science can develop further, and faith doctrines can also develop further, which means that our current understanding of science and that our current understanding of faith is imperfect.
Right.
And so when we see a potential point of tension, it's due to a tolerance stack up of our unknowledge, which is, look, I if I had a perfect understanding of faith and of religious claims, and if I had a perfect understanding of scientific claims, if I knew the truth, I wouldn't have any tension or contradictions.
It's the expectations that cause the conflicts.
It's the expectations based on our current imperfect knowledge.
Exactly.
But then also considering it from a human perspective, I can't help but think of our experience as human beings. We tend to justify what we do. And sometimes I think that scientific people and religious people will use these sorts of pieces of knowledge in order to justify, like, immoral behavior or this sort of thing or that sort of thing. And I think we can't forget when we're talking about these questions, the human side of things.
I like bringing the psychological aspect to this conversation.
Yeah. Well,
I'm gonna bring the math right back in. We're taking a couple data points out of context and we're extrapolating.
Well,
without getting the whole picture.
It did hit me. I work as a psychotherapist, mainly with kids, and I have found that I come from a more human understanding, right? Because none of these questions really matter to any other creature or any other life form, right? Like, no dog is going to care, right? That
about the
origins of the universe, or
something
like
mark
that. Right?
Of us being human.
Exactly. These questions are innately human, and they happen within the context of our lives, right? That it's not just these scientists. It's these scientists and these religious people who are operating within the context of human relationships and political happenings and certain centuries and eras, and they have their own sort of struggles with emotions and depression and certain behaviors that they aren't completely at terms with, and I can't help but think that does play out in these tensions that we're talking about, right? That human beings, some of the reasons why these tensions happen is because there's a lot of
human imperfection.
Human imperfection, exactly.
Yeah, I think that kind of maybe close the loop on that. Do we have any other comments about that or anything you said? Kind of taking almost the other side of the coin here. Are there any claims that our religious dogma makes which can't be validated by science at all? Like maybe science has nothing to say about afterlife, or science has nothing to say about the Eucharist.
So it's the majority of our claims.
That's a lot of claims about faith.
Mary crowned Queen of Heaven. That's dogma.
The assumption.
Yeah.
Can we
Human
prove that
soul.
scientifically?
The biggest,
Afterlife.
I think the biggest thing is free will, because I know there's some people who believe that brains are like computers, and I remember listening to someone who
Sam Harris.
doesn't believe in
Sam
free
Harris.
will,
Oh, yeah.
and they were saying that you put someone in jail after raping someone because they, it's like an actor, right? And you expect that in this play, this actor will do the same action again. Therefore, you must put this person in jail to prevent them from doing it again. But it's not free will because it is like a computer program is set to go, and then everything that's going around in the environment, the electrons are firing in perfect continuation. You can expect this is going to happen again, versus the free will of a human being where we have our souls, we have our choice. In order to do whatever we want, we make that poor choice in order to
That's kind of
do
a-
those things.
Yeah, that's kind of a contention point, you could say, between the science and religion, because
Free will. Yeah, so you could.
that's a whole rabbit hole right there.
Either side of the coin, right?
Yeah.
Maybe science says nothing about free will. Like if you have a scientific worldview, nowhere in that space would you find anything like a free will. On the other side of the coin, faith makes a claim about free will, which is
That we have
it's
it.
critical to our ethics.
Right, but that's a jump, right? So for scientists or science to try to that's not science's job, right? To prove that there is free will, right?
Yeah.
Science is just looking at the neurons that are firing. Science is just looking at how this works. It's not saying anything other than that. And I think, for scientists to say anything more, say like about then he's entering into a different realm, the philosophical realm.
Right.
It's a different. They're different questions.
Well,
Yeah.
there's. I was gonna say, like, I think the free will it's basically free will versus determinism debate. There is sort of a scientific versus philosophical, or there's a philosophical debate in the sense of, can we prove scientifically that humans don't have free will? But really, if you kind of just like a quick overview of that is there's three essential camps, which is one is free will. We absolutely have free will, and even if we can show that we're physical entities with brains, we still have complete control of our actions. Then there's another camp, which is the other extreme, which is hard determinism, which is all of our actions have been predetermined from the start of the universe based on the fact that our brain is a configuration of different atoms, and you can theoretically predict the motion of atoms in the universe, so we can predict all actions that a person will take. Therefore, we can predict what you're going to do, and therefore you have no free will. And there's actually a third camp, which is called compatibilism, which is, I looked this up on Wikipedia, so I know what I'm talking about, but which I think is kind of an interesting idea, which is you can theoretically, if you were to understand the state of every single atom in your brain, you could, in theory, predict what a person is going to decide. But just because you can make that prediction doesn't make it any less valid that they're still making that decision.
What about the idea of the religious idea that many Protestant faiths have, or general Christian faiths have, predestination, where God essentially pre-programs you? Because also that's...
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
Well,
that actually kind of goes well with the hard determinism if you believe in predestination.
Yeah, so you can use science and religion, or at least philosophy, to come to the conclusion that we are completely determined.
Well, I think this kind of serves the broader point that we were just making a few minutes ago, which was, if you just have a scientific worldview, maybe you could have disagreements about free will, right? You were saying secular philosophers have three different camps.
Mm-hmm.
These aren't religious people, these are just philosophers. And you could divide them into three different camps. And then you could take religious people and divide us into camps, right? So in the secular philosophers, you have your free will yes, free will no, compatibilism. And then you have, in the religious camp, sort of a predeterminism, and then a more of a free will camp, right?
Right.
Even then, and so this kind of goes back to what we were saying about how it's just imperfect human knowledge creating this appearance of tension, whereas if we had full knowledge of everything, a perfect faith description and a perfect science description, we wouldn't really sense this tension.
Right, and that's what I mean, because a dog's not going to have that tension, right? The dog is just operating in the context of where it finds itself in the universe,
Right.
without any sort of tension, right? I mean, it might get hungry sometimes, but it's going to go eat, and that's part of the harmony that it's only us humans that really see this tension.
Yeah, and I think we did a good job talking about how we see this tension as just a psychological phenomenon due to our imperfection. I think what I want to get to here now is the other side of the coin, which is, do we have any problem accepting faith claims that don't have a scientific basis? So maybe science doesn't say anything about Mary being the Queen of Heaven, right? Science is totally just, it's got nothing. We can't empirically verify that at all. Why, as scientifically literate people, what do we make of these claims, like the Eucharist and the soul and afterlife? And
if you go back to our original kind of things we were talking about, which is that you have the scientific way of knowing of the world, and you have the religious way of knowing of the world, which I think all of us in this room agree that both views of the world are valid. Then if you have a religious view that can't be verified by science, that's not really a conflict, in my opinion. As long as it does, I would say, in a sense, as long as it doesn't contradict a scientific worldview. Although you have to figure out what's the priority is. If you have a conflict, which one are you going to choose over? What are you going to choose, religious or scientific?
Right. So there's no.
But if it's something that can't be falsified or proven, then then my scientific worldview doesn't, for my personal beliefs, it doesn't conflict at all, because it's just a completely different realm of
Right.
Well,
knowing.
again, we don't live like that, right? When it comes to matters of faith, right? Then this becomes a problem, right? That because we all take leaps and bounds in our thinking, right? That
Mhm.
I believe that England is an island. I'm probably never
Never
going to
seen
walk
it,
around
never
it, right?
measured it.
So it's
never-
only when it comes to these questions that we start to say, right, we need like verified proof that, well, what's the central claim of Christianity? That Jesus Christ, God made man, died and rose again, right? Is there any way that we can prove that scientifically?
No.
Well,
think so.
tell me more.
We have the historical records, but we're living in the now, not in the then. Where science is
Scripture
at
and
this
tradition.
level right now, but it was at that level then. So currently, we cannot scientifically prove whether or not that happened.
So I think we kind of opened with, as religious people, how do we view science? Let me flip it on its head and maybe ask a deeper question. As people who are scientifically minded, why would we believe in the faith stuff?
It's all logical. Faith, Thomas Aquinas, especially with his proofs, shows, and often, time and time and again, we show the logic behind the faith, Thomas Aquinas' proofs, and just how clear cut our faith is.
Well,
and
I mean, to a certain degree, yes, it's logical, but it's. I heard someone say this before. I forget who it was, but you have Thomas Aquinas' 5 proofs. But how do you get from there to the concept of a loving God, who's present in each and every one of our lives? That's. I mean, yes, you could get so far logically, but the claims a lot of Catholics make in the fullness of our faith, it's
Right. The farthest
how far can you go?
Yeah, Aristotle, the farthest he could say was that there was a God, right? But he couldn't say anything more than that, right? And he was using pure reason.
I
takes
kind of want to jump to Jameson's defense for a second, because it's super important to have a logically coherent worldview, and just showing that the way you think about things and the way you see things, that it's logically coherent. That's a huge step in whether or not it's going to be true or whether it's reasonable, and that's absolutely true. Now, I think there's a question of evidence too, because a scientifically minded way of viewing things is it's got to have the logical coherence, but it's also have to have evidence supporting it, right? And so, aren't we scientifically minded people? So why would we believe things without evidence?
So the way I kind of view my faith and how it fits into my worldview is, so I'm not going to be able to sit here and explain every single reason why I believe what I believe with Catholicism. But the way I kind of see it is, everyone has this sort of hole in their belief or hole in their life. There's something that they need, some explanation for the why of why they exist, why they continue to live their life. And the world offers many different shapes to sort of fit this hole. And you can try putting all these different shapes in to fill this hole. But from my experience, you could say the Catholic shape is the one that best fits that hole. It's the thing that sort of makes my life whole and integrated. And there's nothing else there's no other explanation or thing that I can fill in my life that makes everything else makes as much sense as it does. So that's a very general explanation of why I believe what I believe, and it would take a long time to try to explain every single detail.
Yeah, so
but
maybe-
that's the best way I can
But that's
describe
it, right? That's exactly why all of us are here.
Mhm.
Is because people have shared just that experience with other people, right?
yes,
So the first apostle said, "We found a guy, and he rose from the dead." And from those 12 men, right, everybody had to take them on their word. And it's just that that sharing of an experience that you've had
Mhm.
that changes people's hearts and minds. But it's not scientific, right? It's not based
Right.
on strict evidence.
by definition, religion means relationship, and I feel like everyone in this room right now, we all have that personal experience that, like you said, causes us to fill that hole or see that the Catholicism fills that hole perfectly. It's beyond the scientific reasoning, the logic. It's that personal experience that it's kind of the ribbon that binds everything together.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's St. Augustine, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. It's, it's that elements that makes us human, our intellect and our will, is always kind of searching for the infinite. It's not really satisfied until it finds something akin to it, and that's what leads people towards faith, beyond what science can offer. It enters into the realm of the personal,
So, to kind of phrase this answer in terms of the question, if the question is why would we believe things, if we're scientifically minded, why would we believe things without evidence? I think the kind of vibe that I'm getting is almost a unanimous, well, there sort of is evidence of our experiences, where if you say, look, if there's a hole in the human heart and the human soul, well, that's data in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's qualitative. It's not. We can't describe it in proper scientific terms at the moment. And maybe that goes back to our imperfect knowledge.
Yeah, but
it's from our personal observation.
Yeah, there's an observable desire and longing for it.
Yeah.
The thing is, I don't need everything in my life to have a perfectly scientific explanation for it, because I was created a certain way. You could say I was evolved to think a certain way, or maybe God allowed evolution to allow me to think a certain way. But the way I live and experience my life, I feel like myself, I don't need a scientific explanation for everything in my life. And I think you can there's a lot of different ways to try to break down a religious belief, and you can certainly attempt to do so by quantifying it. But at the end of the day, that's not really what's compelling for me, I guess.
Well, the problem, I think, when speaking about the tension between the scientific and the religious, a lot of people who are secularists will often demand an explanation that, for somebody it might be sufficient, just personal experience leads them to the conclusion, but when, religious people try to legislate laws based on their beliefs, for example, for secularists, that the religious explanation is just not going to do it. And so that's where the tension kind of comes to life in common discourse.
Politics or society.
Politics.
Yeah.
How do we run our society? How do we share life with people who don't believe in God and that sort of thing?
Well, it's even dumber than that. Which it kind of amplifies your point. We can't agree how to run a town hall just due to a clash of personalities. Forget how to run a country with people of different ideologies. You know what I'm saying? It's the tension is shallower than you would think. We split apart as individuals even earlier than that.
I don't know if this is too much of a segue but just kind of take what you're talking about, where you're saying we're trying to figure out as this group of people how to run our society. In order to function, in my view, in order to function as a society, we have to hold common beliefs to be true, whether they're proven or not proven. And some of those common beliefs have a bedrock foundation in Judeo-Christian belief, for instance, that every person is valuable, human life is sacred. I think that people have a right to live safely, that people have a right to not be harmed. Those are things that are necessary for a functioning society. And there are also underlying things, there are things that are true according to our religion. Now there's certain aspects, certain more, I'm trying to think how to describe it. So that's kind of like the bedrock of our beliefs, but then the Catholic Church, for instance, has specific rules, like you have to go to Mass every Sunday. And obviously our society, we don't make that a law that you have to go to Mass every Sunday. So there's certain specific aspects, certain specific traditions of religion, which we don't impose on everyone else. But I'd say the bedrock beliefs of our religion are things that everyone in our society, in a sense, have to believe in order for us to have a coherent society. I don't know if that's too much of a segue, but just kind of my thoughts on that.
Well, that's a faith claim, right?
Yeah.
That and I would say that the one statement, right, that we could point to that has created this society is that man is created in the image and likeness of God, and has been endowed with his by his creator with certain inalienable rights.
Right, that the government does not give those rights, but that they're endowed by is
But
greater.
that
That's an
that
important
is
distinction.
that's not a scientific statement.
True. Right. Yes.
So the conversation is kind of starting to do a double helix where there's two strands of thought kind of wrapping around each other. One is the second strand I think we were going down is a bunch of imperfect people living together with different ideas and different experiences and kind of unable to communicate deeply with each other. And then this is kind of prompted by the first strand of thought. To go back to this one more time, maybe, why would scientifically minded people believe things without evidence? And then you said, well, we have these experiences, this religious experience base, and that seems to validate it for us. And no, we're not going to try to phrase it in scientific terms. We don't demand that much of an explanation, that much rigor, let's say, technical rigor, when it comes to defending our worldviews. And maybe the way I would think about that is, why would I believe in the Christian worldview or the Catholic worldview? For me, I had an experience, a divine encounter. It's just an experience of God that happened to happen in the Catholic sacramental life. It's just for some reason it was the Catholic rituals that made me have this experience of God, and it was fleshed out in the Catholic life, and it was reinforced by the Catholic lifestyle and the Catholic community, and then it spilled out in overwhelmingly positive ways into how I navigate ethics and relationships and navigating the interior life and finding purpose and balancing that with a scientific worldview, right? It's this waterfall of, I've had an experience of the divine because of the Catholic Church, basically. And so that's how I cultured it, and it kind of spilled out in really good ways into the different areas of my life. And so there's a sort of evidence there, and there's a sort of non-evidence there. The evidence would be, look how it's playing out into my life. It's just good. If you're teaching a classroom, you're teaching a math class, and you ask Timmy, hey, what's the end to this multiplication problem? And Timmy starts like twitching, and his head does a 360-degree turn. And then he gives you the right answer, right? It's like, oh, that was weird, but he gave me the right answer, right? And then you give him a harder problem, and Timmy does, he does a cartwheel, and he gives you the right answer. It's like, I don't know what Timmy's doing, but he's giving me the right answer all the time. Sure, it's not a scientific understanding of Timmy, but sure. But sure. And yeah.
To kind of build off that, I had a similar religious experience where mine was just more of general Christianity. So at the time of my life, I was in high school, and I was looking at Christianity as a whole and exploring my different options. I was raised Catholic, but I was, wasn't very devout Catholic at the time. And the way that I looked at it is that Catholicism is the one Christian faith that seems to not cut corners. And to me, it seemed like, Catholicism was this foundation, and then, Protestantism, being a Baptist, and all the other subdivisions of Christianity, it seems like it was like Catholicism minus this, or Catholicism minus this, or Catholicism minus this. And I said, well, what's the one unifying factor between all Christian faiths? It's like, well, foundation is in Catholicism. So to me, that's what kind of led me to believe, not just that I was raised Catholic, but the one common ground is that they were all seemed to be centered around the Catholic beliefs. So rather than Catholicism is the shoe that fits, it's the design for the shoe.
Would you say it's like universal?
Yeah, in the Christian faith.
So there seems to be a core of experience which is kind of unique to each individual, but for some reason the Catholic faith seems to be the language game that naturally describes our experience.
Well, another thing too is, if we're getting into personal testimonies, just one...
I think that's where it's taken us. Yeah.
One thing I found is Catholicism presents certain moral truths or obligations, a way to not necessarily behave so much as conduct your life, and the what the Catholic Church proposes, I think, is the most fruitful of any way you could live your life. I mean, you look at, for example, promiscuity in teens, and people who are more promiscuous are exhibit higher levels of anxiety and suicidality. You can look at the evidence, but I guess the way Catholicism, the way you conduct your life in terms of obeying Catholic laws, I think for me kind of inspired me to explore further. I mean, because I went off the rails for a little bit, and kind of an untimely cancer diagnosis brought me back and woke me up and kind of told me, like, at the end of my life, what's really going to matter. I want to have an ordered life that's fruitful, and I don't know, now I'm getting into sort of, it was a combination of the fruitfulness of the moral law proposed by the Catholic Church, but also the closeness that we all are at all times to death and kind of a final end to things, and we have to reconcile that with our lives. And it's abject scientific rigor is not necessarily going to come up with a satisfactory answer to me or to people in general in terms of the value of one's life.
So I think with your experience of being faced with something that was potentially life ending, it allows you to view life in the lens of what is ultimately really important. And it seems like you're following your Catholic faith is what turned out to be just from your experience, to be the thing that's the most beneficial. But the other thing too with the Catholic moral life is, if it's true, we would expect to see benefits from following the Catholic moral life, and if we don't follow it, we'd expect to see negative effects. And I think a great example, and we're kind of starting to touch on that, is especially with the Catholic Church's teaching on sexual morality. And society right now has one set of morality for sexuality, and the Catholic Church uses something different. So you have current culture, which is that
It's consent.
Consent. The ultimate morality is a consensual, but really it's, as long as it's two consenting adults that both agree to do it, it's a good thing. It feels good, it's a good thing. Use birth control, use condoms.
Don't hurt each other.
Yeah, as long as you're having fun, it's good. But when you actually follow that way of living, it's actually pretty easy to make an argument that that's actually not the best way to live your life, because for one, health reasons, you get sexually transmitted diseases, unwanted pregnancy. For just personal reasons, just talk to people that have engaged in a lot of different sexual encounters, and they'll tell you it leads to a sort of shallow experience of just having one night stands with people.
It's unsatisfying, even if it seems happy.
Right. So.
Oh, it's miserable.
It's a rabbit hole.
Right. I mean, people can speak from personal experience. Yeah. If you follow what society tells you is the way to live as far as your sexual life, it's just leads to emptiness, brokenness, broken relationships, broken families.
Emptiness.
Yeah. Well, is this the track we're going down? Or?
I think it's the track we're going down. Let's just take it and run.
Yeah. Well, maybe to make a meta observation is, we kind of started with, how do we see science as religious people? And there's kind of this undertone in our culture of, why are you religious if you're scientifically minded? And we kind of had this intellectual discussion of, where do we locate science in the larger worldview? And it was kind of an abstract thought experiment. What we're getting to is just experiences which formed us and into the people we are, and what formed our identities, and what were the core experiences there. And there's this sort of religious experience at the heart of this all, and I think that's where it's taking us. Mm-hmm.
Faith by definition is a belief, so I think as much as we're scientific and logical people, what it boils down to is, what is our belief, what's personal to us, what's important to us, and where do we find it in our hearts. So even though as scientific and religious people, where we find logic in everything, it boils down to what are our hearts searching for.
Are you sure you're an engineer? Because every time you speak, I'm like, he's got to be an artist. Because earlier you were talking about ribbons and how they connect us together. And
he was just tickling the ivories earlier. Right?
I'm a firm believer that art makes life pleasant, but engineering makes it comfortable. And without both of them together, life would be crap.
There you go. Okay. The few thoughts. Again, I go back to the human experience, and I think that's where we're going with this, is that nobody lives their day-to-day lives. And I'm thinking about your original comment, Stephen, about you saw people saying, like, I believe in science over religion. Nobody actually lives like that, right? And, they sort of, they put science and religion in these two teams, right? Oh, like team science over here and team religion over here. And as people of faith, we don't really see that same tension that they do. For the reason that I think as people of faith we recognize that we are not purely scientific-minded beings, right? And I think that's where a lot of the tension comes from in secular people, is that they believe, people like Sam Harris, right, that we are first and foremost rational creatures. That is garbage. We are first and foremost emotional creatures, okay? If you look at any sort of serious brain study of the brain and how our emotions operate and how the brain interacts, the lower brain, the part of our brain that's the oldest, evolutionarily speaking, plays a significant impact in how we process our experiences, how we code information, and it really colors the lens through which we see the world, right? I do a lot of work with people who go through trauma, especially kids, and I can tell you that the first 4 years of a child's life is the most important, developmentally speaking. So if they suffer a trauma during that time, the brain codes things for the rest of their lives in a certain way. Now, I mention all this because, again, we are first and foremost emotional creatures, okay? The lower brain is where we have our emotions, and then it's only after, millions of years that we develop this frontal lobe that's able to put on the brakes, okay? But that's basically, I don't want to put it too simplistically, but essentially the upper brain puts on the brakes, okay? Tells, like, okay, slow down, like, hold on, lower brain, let's think, let's work this out.
Like largely inhibitory in its action.
Largely inhibitory is what I would argue, and that is only out of some sort of miracle that we're actually able to inhibit our emotions, our lower base desires.
Yeah, base desires.
Right, it's kind of a
drives.
miracle, right? That we are even able to have in this room, these kinds of people with the experiences that we've had, with the way that we are tempted to operate, on a day-to-day basis. So people don't live their lives scientifically, and I really want to stress that. So people who say, like, I believe in science over religion are trying to, I think, push ideologies that aren't, that really don't seem to me to be tenable, especially in this day and age and in our culture, in the way that we live our lives. I'm sorry, that was a really big tangent. I'm not sure where that went, but maybe there's thoughts.
I love talking about that and like hearing about that. I like the idea that, or this is like just quick side tangent, the idea that the prefrontal cortex, people often think that their prefrontal cortex, or like their higher thinking, is what is driving all their actions, but there's a lot of scientific, kind of just very general description, a lot of scientific evidence that actually it's our prefrontal cortex which is serving our limbic system or our lower brain, and that we kind of have it backwards, that we think we make these, when we make a decision we think we're doing it for all these higher reasons, but it's to serve some base function, and then our prefrontal cortex basically comes up with an explanation for why we perform some action, when in reality we did it to serve our more base functions, but we think we did it for some.
And I think that's what I was trying to get at, is when we're trying to, I think, talk about this science versus religion and the way we understand the world. Is it purely scientific? Is it purely based on faith and sort of gut intuition? It's important to really recognize how people make these decisions and come to these conclusions is in the context of our human experience. And that's kind of where the conversation went, was our human experience. We've all had religious experiences that I'd say were largely mysterious to us, right? Based on the culture's beliefs, we would think that, yeah, have sex with whoever you want, whatever you want, and it'll be fine, right? But we all recognize that for some reason doesn't work.
Yeah, I really like what you were saying. One asterisk maybe, the belief that people are just rational. I wouldn't ascribe that to Sam Harris. I think actually almost the opposite idea is in vogue now, which is people are just irrational, and we should look to reason to solve all these irrationalities.
We should just try to be happy. That's it.
But I think to the larger point, which was, look, we've had a core of experience, and we've been exposed to this lifestyle and taught this way of life, and have these experiences which are just good. It checks out. It works. It's satisfying, and not only that, maybe we can't quite articulate how we can't perfectly articulate how we formed this worldview, or trace how it developed inside of us very well. But we do have a sort of language game to describe. We do have a lexicon to at least describe these experiences. We talk about faith in God and morality in this religious language, and I think the religious language, actually, we've been talking a lot about the imperfection and irrationality of people. I think, to the church's credit, it has a vocabulary, and we've done theology to understand our worldview and these experiences that we're having and to navigate them. So there's a rationality that's blended with these experiences. There's a desire to understand, to identify, to verbalize, to understand, and to analyze these experiences, but it's an attempt to understand what's going on with us in our hearts. And
I mean, it's theology is like a macrocosm of our own unique personal experience. Our rationality or reason is always coming from the framework of emotionality. We always have emotional reactions to things, and we can react to those emotional reactions reasonably, irrationally, using our reason. But there's the same way theology is sort of reason intertwined with emotional or religious experiences we might have. It's the same way we conduct our lives, or we're always having emotional experiences, but reason is always intertwined with them. But that's the key word, intertwined. It's not like our reason stands alone, nor does our emotional. That's human nature, I guess.
maybe one more deep question, because I think we're getting there. How would a religious experience be different from just raw emotion? Or are religious people just emoting?
Well, no,
Yeah.
not necessarily. I mean, the spiritual, it doesn't really rely on feelings, I guess. I mean,
It's on experiences, not feelings.
yeah.
And though experiences invoke feelings, it's on the experience, not the feeling.
I think it's when you have an experience and you can fit it within a certain, and when you're in the moment, it's hard to know for sure whether it's an emotional or if it's a genuine spiritual experience or if it's an emotional experience, but you're able to fit it into some greater theological explanation, and if it sort of checks out with what you I guess makes sense, or what you believe to be true, then you can maybe say it's a spiritual experience. I don't know. I'm actually kind of speaking. I actually don't really know for sure.
You could, going off what you're saying, you could you could use certain individuals, like Mother Teresa, for example, the dark night of the soul or whatever. She didn't feel God for the majority of her life. She didn't believe because of feeling. It was something more, something beyond what she could feel, because she had a total absence of any kind of spiritual feeling or consolation, if you will.
Maybe another spin on this. The way I would kind of describe an encounter with God, like a divine experience, would be almost like an experience of nature. Like if you're seeing a mountain and an ocean at the same time, you ever just get like overwhelmed? But it's not. There's an emotional response there, but then there's a sort of processing that happens along with it of your place in nature, and it makes you want to uphold, like, because you have this profound experience of nature as beautiful and huge and good, and you're a part of that, and you want to do your part to maintain that beauty and goodness. And so that's how you orient your life. And so when we have an experience of the divine, for me, it's this big and wonderful and good thing. And so when I orient my life towards that beauty and goodness, good things happen as a byproduct. So it seems more than an emotional thing. Like, I'm actually orienting my life in a way that produces goodness.
So I think I would just like to kind of re-explain my explanation. So it's not really useful to think of it as an emotional state, maybe more of a psychological state. And I think spiritual experiences, in a way, it's a psychological state that God, maybe you could do an MRI on someone's brain who's having a spiritual experience, and you can say, okay, this is what it looks like on a brain scan of what a spiritual experience is like. But that doesn't invalidate the spiritual experience, because we are physical creatures. So whatever we're experiencing inside our mind is going to be the result of neurons firing. But God created us, whether through evolution or through spontaneous creation. God created us to be capable of having these psychological states that are spiritual experiences. So, I don't know, maybe psychologist has something else to say about that.
Real quick.
Yeah.
Well, man is two parts there, of body and of soul. And, original sin is what allows our bodies to die and our souls to live on, and then we get our second bodies later. So I think it might be the spiritual experience we're talking about in a psychological realm. But I think it might be something that specifically only affects our soul. So personally, we can't prove it, but I don't think you'd find something on an MRI scan that finds the triggering of a spiritual experience, because we are two parts, of body and of soul. And the of soul part is the part that's difficult to prove via science. And 2 cents before you
I just had several thoughts. First of all, there's a great book called The Idea of the Holy by Rudolf Otto, and it covers exactly this. He looks at religious experiences across culture and tries to really pin down what he calls the pneuma, and it's exactly like this religious experience that goes beyond simply emotion. Second of all, they've actually done research studies of people praying. They've actually had people in MRIs who will read off a sheet of paper, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they'll do a brain scan of that. And then what they'll have them do is they'll take away the sheet of paper and they'll actually have these people pray. And different parts of the brain light up, actually. And it's the same part of the brain when someone's praying. It's the same sections of the brain that activate when you're having a conversation with someone else, when you're actually
interesting
talking with somebody else. Second, and I really wish I had the name of the study, and I don't know if it's been replicated, but they've done studies about prayer. And actually, they had specific people pray for specific names of patients who were like cancer or who had serious illnesses. And what they actually found was that the people who were prayed for actually had better outcomes. Than now, obviously, that there's a lot of holes in that, but there have been attempts, right, to try to pin down scientifically what these religious experiences are and how we might be able to measure them. Yeah, I think that's it for now.
That's a really interesting study with prayer and conversation, how that correlates to having a conversation.
So
running out of juice here.
I think we're running out of the juice.
I could keep going.
I
feel like I could keep going too, but
I think this was a great conversation. I think it was also a good experiment in the true spirit of science. I've never seen a podcast with this many people on it.
Yeah.
So I think
pushing the limit. We're pushing the limits of the Squadcast.
Yeah. Well, I think it's
no
hard.
Squadcast has gone before.
Yeah, it's hard to do a deep dive on any one point without someone else having a branch off that somewhere way up here.
Oh, for sure.
And it's kind of off the rails, but I think we did a good job of pretty much hitting some deep ideas and closing some circles on things.
Yeah, I think we closed to the circle on some points. We kind of left some things open-ended, unanswered. Did short forays into
Yeah,
random
well,
topics.
I think there were a lot of details that were kind of left as an exercise to the reader.
Well, in true fashion of science, we
But-
gave the listeners all of the data that they need to come to their own conclusion.
To go do their own, yeah, well, to go do their own research.
everybody.
To go do their own research, yeah. Well, I think this is a conversation that's going to spark other conversations.
Yeah, I feel like we could like do sub podcasts off of some
Some
of the
topics.
stuff that
we
we're
could,
talking
we could
about.
keep going for hours, but none
Oh
of them
my
would
gosh,
be
yeah.
strictly on topic.
I'm actually, it's way past my bedtime right now. So
The old man, get out of here.
Running
All
out
right,
of juice.
that's a podcast.
That's
All
right.
right, good?
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.